Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, this evening, depending on your time zone, it might be a different time, but thank you for joining us. This is the third and fourth lectures in the fall 2005 Lubalin lecture series. My name is Alexander. I'm one of the instructors and in the program, and it's my pleasure to have you guys with us. So the lectures are part of the TypeCulture, which is a postgraduate program in typeface design, which is part of Cooper Union. And the lecture series is presented and organized by both TypeCulture and Lubalin Center, and of course Cooper Union. The lectures are part of the curriculum. The TypeCulture program, if you're not familiar, has quite a lot of content. I'm gonna try to do my usual multitasking, post links in the chat. So you can learn more. TypeCulture has a lot of workshops and 2 certificate programs that they run. And these lectures are very much kind of an integral part of the program and curriculum. I also wanted to extend a huge thank you to TypeCulture, which is sponsoring, make sure I get their link in here, which is sponsoring the recording and the archiving of these lectures. TypeCulture is an incredible resource. It's an independent digital tape foundry, but also a really rich resource of academic material that is run by Mark Jammer. So a huge thank you to them for allowing us to record this lecture and add to our extensive archive. If you've missed any of the lectures we had in this fall cycle, we had David Quay a few weeks ago talking about this idea of being a type tourist and kind of looking at the city through the rich signs that you could see. And then we had another lecture a couple of weeks ago by Carolyn Archer-Perret talking through the Baskerville's the legacy of Baskerville's typefaces. So the lecture is small performances, the making of Baskerville typefaces, and something that is a big project that's ongoing for several years. So kind of you get a short peek. If you missed any of these, you can catch recordings on our website, coopertype.org/lectures. You can just go find the lecture and look at the recording built in there, or you can go to Vimeo and find that there directly. I will again post the links in here so you have them. You can open the links. It's Zoom has a habit not making chat savable, so just click on the links and if you wanted to save them, if you wanted to look at them again. But we're also very happy to have 2 presenters with us today talking about the Romain du Roi, essentially 330 years, according to various accounts. Dates are always tricky, but it's a roughly 330 years since the project in at least the type part had begun. It certainly could be much longer, but it feels appropriate to think about this and 330 years later. And before I introduce our 2 esteemed speakers, I wanted to take a moment to pay tribute to James Moseley, who sadly passed away earlier this year at the age of 90. James was a British librarian, preservationist, and historian who specialized in the history of printing type and lettering. He became a visiting lecturer and professor at the University of Reading in 1964. He was a founding member of the British Printing Historical Society that year, as well as the first editor of its journal, a fantastic publication. Through decades of teaching at the University of Reading and his role as librarian for 42 years at St. Brian's Printing Library in London, James helped guide the research of countless students of type. His legacy is certainly immense. James, in this image here, is overseeing the reinstatement of lettering on the HMS Victory back in October of 2015. This is a little while back, but the lettering was drawn and directed by John Morgan, who we also sadly lost this year, and also Adrian Vasquez, who worked on this project. The lettering here was painted by Phil Surrey with guidance and historical research that James Moseley put together. So the James's legacy is immense. Without his commitment and research, a lot of what we know and understand about many facets of type design and type history would be impossible. And certainly that's true for Romain du Roi project. So this is a huge loss for the type community, but his legacy and the work that he did is obviously living on. And I think the lecture today is a huge testament to the work that he's put in. And so I'm very, very honored to have two presenters who continue the legacy and continue to extend the research that James has done and certainly keep his work quite alive. And so with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our two esteemed researchers and presenters. I'm so glad that they could take time out of their very busy schedule this time of the year for everyone to be here today and share their insight and research. So a huge thank you to them for their time and commitment. So I'll present them in order that they'll present. Riccardo, Olocco, and Sarah Grandin will take turns. And at the end, we'll have a short Q&A between the three of us. First, I'll introduce Riccardo, and then I'll introduce Sarah. Riccardo Olocco is a designer and researcher, visiting research fellow at the University of Reading, where in 2019, he completed his PhD, which is titled A New Method of Analyzing Printed Type, the Case of 15th Century Venetian Romans. He's a prolific lecturer and has authored many articles, a few books, and is a board member of the Nebbiolo History Project. He is also a practicing typeface designer and a member and co-founder of CAST, Cooperativa Anonima Servizi Tipografici. Dr. Sarah Grandin is a lecturer in the arts of early modern France at the Courtauld Institute of Art. She specializes in 17th and 18th century French visual material culture. Prior to joining the Courtauld, she was a postdoctoral researcher at the Clark Art Institute. She served as the Lund Fellow and as the Clark Getty Paper Project Curatorial Fellow, in which capacity she co-curated the exhibition Promenades on Paper, 18th Century French Drawings from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and was co-editor of the accompanying catalog. Her first monograph, titled To Scale, Manufacturing Grandeur in the Age of Louis XIV, is in preparation. Throughout her research, she investigates the relationship between making and knowing, particularly in the artisanal realm. So you'll hear quite a bit about that overlap with Romain du Roi in this presentation. So first of all, thank you both. I will switch it over to Riccardo, and then Riccardo will pass it on to Sarah. So thank you again. I'm super excited for this talk.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to give this presentation. This is a topic that I find very fascinating. So my presentation will just focus on the initial stage of the development of the Romain du Roi. So the type known as the Romain du Roi was developed as a part of a larger project connected to the French Academy of Science. In January 1693, a committee of 3 people met under the chairmanship of a young and ambitious churchman, the Abbé Jean-Paul Bignot. These people began work on an extensive account of the arts and craft. Their aim with words and images. And the printing was to come first, because printing preserves all the other crafts. So the 3 members, they all had the scientific background. Jean Truchet, had experience in constructing hydraulic machinery, and he later became a member of the Carmelite order, and he took the name of Sébastien, and is remembered as Sébastien Truchet, but his real name was Jean. Jacques Jean-Jean, on the other hand, also had some practical knowledge of technology, and it was Jean-Jean who undertook the task of writing up the volume about printing and connected trades, which is held at the Bibliothèque de l'Institut in Paris. This text has never been published. And over the past 50 years, James Mosley transcribed the entire volume and published some sections of it, including the section on the typefander mold. Less than 1 year after its start, so in 1694, the Bignot Committee shifted its focus from the main project to a specific task, that was creating a perfect design of letters, in order to reform the types that were currently in use in the Imprimerie Royale office. Despite the rich documentation that has survived, the reason why the Bignot committee started working on the Romain du Roi remains unclear. Several accounts have survived, but they were all written many years later and they cannot be fully trusted. Mosley suspects that the Abbé Bignot played an important role in this. The Abbé Bignot was the leader of the committee, but he was also put in charge of the publishing of a large and luxurious book, which, through displaying the royal medals, was intended to honor the grandeur of the reign of Louis XIV. Bignot probably thought that such a significant project required a new typographic vest, and the committee was equipped to deliver it. Bignot was able to convince the director of the Imprimerie Royale to allocate funding for it. And between the 1694 and the 96, the Bignot committee spends most of its time on this project. Alongside the design of the letters, which we'll see shortly, the committee undertook a related task in order to improve the printing trade. They plan a series of mathematically related bodies in order to replace the approximate sizes supplied by contemporary type funders. Truchet was responsible for it. Truchet took measurements directly from the pages of the book and found that the size of bodies designated by a specific name, for instance, Cicero, that is a pica in English, basically. Cicero is the French name. So a Cicero varied a lot from funder to funder. And types called Cicero could vary from 11 to 13 points or even more. André Jams published a fully worked out scheme, which you can see here. As Jam claims, this is the origin of a system of typographical points, of which Fournier-Lejeune would claim the invention 50 years later. This scheme was signed on the same date on which a price was set for the cutting of the punches of the Romain du Roi, the same exactly date. The two projects were clearly intertwined. The bodies of the new punches that Grandin was to cut were based on Truchet's system of related type bodies. Truchet later changed the scale of proportions and kept on working on its system, which is set out in detail in a plate engraved for the section of punch cutting. Truchet decided to determine all the components on the letter, not just the body. So in this scheme, we can find indication for the exit, the ascenders, the descenders, and the stem thickness, and even other details. When the committee began focusing on the design of the letterforms, they spent some time in research. They studied several sources. Firstly, they studied the punches and matrices of Imprimerie Royale, which also included several series cut by Garamond and Grandin. Then they collected the best printed letters in books printed in the past, held at the Bibliothèque Royale. They also consulted the writers who had provided rules and proportions for the letters, such as Pacioli, Dürer, Tori. Well, actually, Jean wrote that they consulted all the writers. They also mentioned Sigismondo Fanti, which was peculiar. And the committee also studied the most beautiful manuscripts in the Bibliothèque Royale, where there was an extensive collection of contemporary French calligraphers. You know, this is quite important, and a calligraphy school flourished in France in the second half of 1600. And the style that was called caractère bâtard, which bâtard has nothing to do with Gothic script. The connection with Gothic script had disappeared before. This style of italic was derived from the Italian models of the late 1500, basically what was started by Cresci, with Cresci. But the work of masters such as Jarry and such as Senot, that you see here, their work display a much greater sobriety that is seen in the Baroque models. I would call it an elegant rigidity, and mostly claims that we can see some reflection of a society in which this style of writing flourished. Please, please note the romanized serifs on the top of the M and N. We will see them later in the Romain du Roi. And also the tiny spur on the right of L, that you can see here. This is very tiny, but you see it at the X side. And we see a similar spur in H too. And see also the two different shapes, the alternatives of H. The second shape of H, the round H, was the traditional shape, while the first one that you see, that is the one we are used to today, it was introduced basically in the 17th century, basically. The committee also studied the work of some printers, such as Pierre Moreau, that was a writing master in Paris, who printed books in a calligraphic cursive type in the 1640s. We know very little about Pierre Moreau, but he basically hired a punch cutter to cut a type according to its calligraphic style. And we see the letters are quite peculiar. It's undeniable that they are elegant, but there is also quite a certain rigidity. And please note the letter L with the spur. It's still here. And also the N with this initial stroke. It is not very horizontal, but it's very similar to Roman. We can hardly imagine the powerful influence that these manuscripts had on the craftsmen engaged in the creation of a letter that was meant to follow the taste of the time. Now, I think that Jean is right when he says that the Romain du Roi was likely an attempt to translate into type the grace and elegance of the calligraphy of Jarry and his successors. The most famous output of the Bignot Committee is the plates engraved into copper with the constructions of letters. They were published for the first time in their entirety by Jean in 1961, so almost 300 years after they were designed and engraved. The surviving plates, and we presume that other plates were lost over the centuries, the surviving plates were designed at three different times. The first group, which is the only one that interests us today, were engraved in 1695. The same letter forms are shown twice, as you can see here, once in white with construction circles and once in dark gray without the construction circles. There are other two sets that were engraved much later, and especially they were made long after that the letters of the punches had been established. While the first set that you just saw was engraved before the work on the punches had begun. And this is quite important, as we're going to see. A large section of Jean-Jean's manuscript is about the detailed construction of the letters that were engraved in 1695. From this source and from other notes that have survived, we know that decisions about the forms of the letters were jointly taken within the commission. So everyone in the commission was in charge of the shape of the letters. However, their discussions were usually based on a model. We were talking about models, and we think that these models were drawings. And the models, the drawings, were provided by Jean-Jean. What is clear in Jean-Jean text is that the plates were conceived for guiding the eye of a punch cutter. They had to be transferred into steel and precisely as possible, but the committee was well aware that the geometric grid was useless when reduced. At small sizes is the eye of the craftsman that must decide, and here I'm quoting Jean-Jean. This is very important because this contradicts the general view promoted by Fournier and accepted by several historians, for instance Updike. According to them, these engravings are just purely academic exercise with ruler and compass. Grandin. Grandin was about 25 years old when he started working on the project. He was probably the only punch cutter available in Paris at the time. He was an inexperienced, as remarked by Jean several times. Following the death of the second Sanlec in 1660, there were no longer any punch cutters in France. This is something that Fournier remarked. Grandin learned punch cutting from an engraver of the Mint in Paris, who occasionally turned to punch cutting to supply the needs of the Parisian type founders. Because during this period, during the second half of the 1600, capital J and capital U were introduced in French printing, and so there was a need of punch cutters to provide these letters to the type founders, to the local type founders. Grandin had worked before the Romain du Roi. He had worked for Imprimerie Royale in the previous years. He was hired to make new punches and matrices for the Grix du Roi, the same Grix du Roi that was cut by Garamond in 1540. Grandin was inexperienced, as remarked by Jean several times. And, at the National Archive in Paris, there are accounts submitted by Grandin that they are called the Mémorois for the cutting of the first size of the Romain du Roi, which was about 16 points. The work was officially assigned in 1694, the same date that was confirmed the Truchet scheme that we've seen before. But Grandin did not begin working on it until the end of the following year, until October 95. He was probably waiting for the plates to be provided. The first reference to the work of punches dates November 95, and you see here, and it doesn't sound good. The committee met with Grandin to check his initial work, and the engraver Simoneau was also present. Grandin was 1 week late, and, as Jean suggests, this passage seems to point to a certain tension between the committee and its punch cutter. Well, we know that the initial work on Romain du Roi was not easy. And this is the list of punches and other work provided by Grandin between summer 97 and the early months of 99, so in about 1 year and a half. And this was the core of the design of the punches of the first size of the Romain du Roi, which is the 16 points. Grandin's first punches were rejected, all of them. The documents say destroyed, and they were remade. And actually, most of the letters had to be recut several times, and also had to be, matrices had to be struck, and cast and type had to be cast to test before repeating all the circle. So it was quite a lot of work. And during this period, the models, the drawings of the letters, were also repeatedly modified. So it was therefore a collaborative effort between the punch cutter and the committee. And we can say that the committee basically acted like a 20th century type designer, more or less like Van Krimpen, Gill, Dwiggins, this kind of people. The Romain du Roi is considered the first example of type design in which the shape of the letters was determined independently on its means of production. However, we must say that the Romain du Roi is not the only case in history where this has happened. Other people have directed the work of punch cutters when they were unable to cut punches themselves. And we can think about Arrighi in Rome in the 1520s. But also John Baskerville in Birmingham did the same 60 years after the Bignon Commission. A trial of the first version of the type has survived, just for printing. And Mosley, who has analyzed it, claimed that the quality of the cutting is uncertain and poor. There is big difference from the Romain du Roi that was eventually released. It seems that both the committee and the punch cutter learned a great deal during the process. And this actually highlights what to me is the most important factor that lies behind the Romain du Roi. I mean that the designers and the punch cutter were both equally inexperienced and were both equally open to new ideas. It's time to look at the Romain du Roi, to look at the type. Our focus, as I mentioned, will be only on the 16-point size, which was the first to be released and on which the overall design features of the type project were established. Actually, it's not exactly 16.5. 16 point is about 15.7, but I say 62 for ease. As it's usually remarked in the histories of printing types, the Romain du Roi was one of the crucial steps in the evolution of modern types, which was to become dominant in printing by the end of the 1700s. So we can say that the Bignot Committee was about 90 years ahead of their time. The design feature of the Romain du Roi that anticipated the modern types are following. So, first of all, a high contrast between thick and thins, and also the vertical axis in all the lowercase letters. In this way, basically, B and D, as well as P and Q, are mirror images of each other. We need to say that C and lowercase e have a perfectly vertical axis of the plates, but their axes are slightly sloped in the type, especially that of E. Then there is a general smoothness of the curves. That is a peculiarity of modern type. Another peculiarity is the capitals of the same height as the ascenders. The serifs are tiny and thin, and they are slightly bracketed in the plates and unbracketed and even thinner in the type. Then we have flat serifs on top of M, N, R, P, and similar letters. And there are tiny round terminals in C, F, in the ear of G, in S and Y. Then there are two design features that become customary in modern French Romans, and we find them in several types cut by or cut for various members of the Didot family. I'm referring to the lowercase s with round terminals instead of vertical serifs, and the letter T with a flat top. Both of these features are seen in the work of the calligraphic masters that we saw before. For instance, Nicolas Jarry used in his Roman formal calligraphy, he was usually writing a lowercase s, a minuscule s with round terminals, and the T with a flat top. Then there is one feature of a lowercase that was so revolutionary that never became a custom in typographic letters. I'm referring to the symmetrical or bilateral, we call it, the symmetrical top serif in the ascenders in I and in G, and in J, sorry, but especially in the ascenders, as you can see here, in B, in L, and in D. So this bilateral, the fact that they are on both the sides, like in capitals, this is very new. And therefore, to distinguish lowercase l from uppercase I, the committee decided to add a spur on the right of L at the backside. This spur looks odd today. However, it was not unusual in calligraphy, as we have seen, and its origin can be traced back to the Middle Ages, when it appeared in Gothic scripts in letters like B, L, and long S. And according to my friend Johan Clayton, this spur was produced by the calligraphic movements needed to write these letters. Contrary to what we could imagine, the revolutionary features of the Romain du Roi seem to have received little discussion in the Bignot Committee. This is the impression that we gain from Jean-Jean's manuscript. Without much discussion, it seems, the committee abandoned the oblique pen angle of humanistic script, which was found in virtually all Roman types produced up to that point. As I said, this was a revolutionary move, 90 years ahead of the advent of modern type. I said that the Romain du Roi embodies an elegant rigidity. However, the stiffness of the design is tempered by the smooth calligraphic quality of the curves. And we can say that the Romain du Roi is the first type to incorporate both the grace of the letters of the calligraphic master of the 1600, and also the precision of the fine lines and of the fluid curves of the copperplate engraver. Another significant innovation of the Bignot Committee was the design of an alphabet that lies between Roman and conventional Italic. Today we would call this a sloped Roman. This alphabet appears in the plates engraved in 1695, but it was never produced as a type. It essentially consists of Roman letters whose shape has been changed by sloping the vertical lines of the grid within which they are drawn. In his manuscript, Jean-Jean wrote that after the trials, it was found that the letters were too similar to both Roman and Italic, so the project was dropped. They said it was not put into general use, to quote Jean-Jean. However, there is no evidence that a type was ever produced based on this model. But importantly for us, it's most probable that this sloped Roman had some influence on the Romanized initial strokes of the lowercase letters in Fournier's New Italics, which became extremely popular in the 1700s. I'm referring to the Roman serif that is found on the top of I, M, N, and similar letters. They became standard feature throughout the types made for Didot Leynet and distinguished French modern Italic types from those of the English school, which have a kind of hook instead of that sign, as it was tradition in italics. However, Grandin supplied an Italic that had nothing to do with those plates. It was much more conservative in its style than the Roman. It seems that the committee was not much involved in the design of Italic, and I wonder why, actually. And Grandin had more freedom when cutting the punches. The Italic du Roi, if we can call it like that, was more regular in its slope than most of the Italics of the previous century. However, its design followed an established model. It does introduce one innovation, though. The shape of lowercase h, which, unlike all the previous Italic types, it follows that of lowercase n, you can see here. Up to then, typographic Italic had always included the round h with the right stem curved inwards. The great folio of the royal medals was finally printed in 1702. It was an enormous undertaking that took years to complete. The type was just one of the many innovations introduced for this edition. The book displays the Romain du Roi for the first time. It's set entirely in the 16 points, the first size on which Grandin worked. By the time of the printing, only one other size of the Romain du Roi had been completed, the Petit Parangon, that is about 19 points. And the Petit Parangon was used only in the preface that was suppressed after printing. And this preface can now be found in only a few surviving copies of the book. 3 sets of large capital letters were also completed, as can be seen in this title page. The smaller size seen in the image, using lines such as the second, is the 16 point, while the 20 point is used for the third line. As can be seen, the type design remains fairly consistent across the different sizes, as has been the case since the 20th century. But this was not common in previous centuries. Usually letters cut by the same patch cutter at different sizes often displayed a slightly different design. In the following years, Grandin cut several other sizes of Romain du Roi. Here you can see the complete list recorded by Mosley with the size names, and they were called with the size names after the mid of the 1700s, when no one in the Imprimerie Royale could understand the Truchet scheme anymore. On the second column, you see the size in points in desktop publishing points, as we are used today, and in the third, the years in which Grandin worked on these types. Grandin died in 1714, and about 10 years later the punch cutter Jean Alexandre was hired to cut other 5 sizes. Finally, toward the middle of the century, Louis Luce cut the last 2 sizes that were initially conceived by Truchet in his scheme in 1695. It seems that the Romain du Roi had very little influence on subsequent types. I'm referring to the Roman, because the italic, as we have seen, was probably the basis for Fournier italics. The Roman could have influenced the Delaunay in the late 1700s, but it seems that the path that led other European printers to modern type had nothing to do with the Romain du Roi. My knowledge on the topic is limited, I need to confess, but it seems that the Imprimerie Royale did not use the types extensively. And the editions printed with the Romain du Roi, such as one that you can see here, were neither numerous nor particularly influential. This is what I gained. Therefore, it is highly unlikely that someone outside France in the 1700s would have been familiar with this type. And I'm thinking about Baskerville and Bodoni, for example. The type became more popular in France towards the end of the century, and it was called the national type during the Revolution. During the Revolution, it became important for the authenticity of official printing, because the British Secret Service were forging documents to spread confusion. However, there was an early imitation, just one, in one size. It was called Cicero La Police and was sold by the type founder Pierre Cotte from 1705 onwards. It also appears in the catalogs of other Parisian type founders in the following decades. I will conclude this short presentation quoting James Mosley, to which I'm in debt for a large amount of information that I have presented today. I was lucky to discuss about the Romain du Roi with James several times. However, his articles on the topics are very important and should be read by anyone who is interested in the Romain du Roi. The Bignot committee was very brave, or maybe very naive, to base a type design on applied reason, because this is what they did. And I think that the independent logic by which they approached their task is really noticeable. Thank you. And I'm heading now to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Riccardo. It was amazing to hear you discuss that type, and so special that you got to study it with James Mosley, to whom I am also in great debt. I would encourage you all to read everything that he's written on the subject, because I don't think either of us would have gotten very far on the subject without his amazing research and generous sharing of his transcriptions and studies. So very special to think about James Mosley this evening. All right. Wonderful. All right. So I'm going to share a little bit more about the context of the Romain du Roi. I am not a specialist of typography nor a practitioner. I'm an art historian who came to this world of type from a different perspective. So I look forward to sharing that with you all. All right, so all of you with expertise in typography and graphic design are sensitive to the fact that minute modifications to a letter's proportions can have a dramatic impact on that letter's appearance and character. This is as true in the design process as it is in the execution of said design. When a type engraver or punch cutter carves a letter, they must work with the greatest possible precision, for the most minute error can lead to the character's total disfigurement. Meditating on this phenomenon, the French type engraver Nelly Gable, with whom I had the pleasure of meeting several years ago in Douai, she described her perception of the forms that emerge from her files as monumental. As observed through her magnifying lens, the smallest scrape of a file substantially alters a letter's appearance. There is then a profound disjunction between the scale of the artisan's gesture and the degree to which such gestures alter the profile of the final letter and its appearance in print. My first book is about the significance of scale in the art of Louis XIV and of how its mastery and manipulation were key to the projection of royal grandeur. And while I was originally drawn to the Romain du Roi as a case study for its ambitions of scalar precision, it remains intriguing to me for the disjunction in scalar attention it evokes and enacts. That is, why was something so small, as small as a piece of type, invested with such great resources? Why did the Crown and its top arts administrators instruct an entire team of academics and artisans to spend years perfecting this product? My objective in today's talk is twofold. First, I want to unpack why it was that the royal administration of Louis XIV went to the trouble of commissioning a typeface to begin with. This is best understood by examining the Romain du Roi in the context of the various publication projects for which its creators were responsible. So I'm going to elaborate a little bit on some of Riccardo's points there. Second, I want to examine the role of the artisan within these projects, and I want to do so through a close reading of the way practitioners of the book arts were characterized and represented throughout these editorial enterprises. In investigating these two strands, two facts emerge. First, type and print were understood as existing on a continuum with the numismatic arts in terms of their technique, their prestige, and their purpose. Second, unity and regularity were of paramount importance in the artistic program of Louis XIV. Before answering these questions and exploring these insights, however, I want to reintroduce the Bignon Commission, its main actors, and the publications on which its actors labored. So this is just going to sort of reinforce and complement some of what Riccardo shared. So yes, it was headed by the Abbé Jean-Paul Bignon, and it was a satellite operation to the Académie Royale des Sciences, of which Bignon was director from 1691 to 1743. And it's notable that he also had a stint as the director of the Royal Library. Beginning in 1692, 6 men met weekly at the Abbé's home: the Carmelite mathematician Père Sébastien Trouchet, the savant Gilles Fiot de Billette, and Jacques Jojon, who was the author of the manuscript that Riccardo shared. And also often in attendance were the Imprimerie Royale's director Jean Anisson, the printmaker Louis Simoneau, and the type engraver Philippe Grandin. So first, this group of academics and practitioners set out to publish a sort of encyclopedia of the mechanical arts, which they called the Description des Arts et Métiers, the description of arts and trades, which is figured here by this diagram on the art of type founding. While the commission never completed the Description des Arts, this composition shows workers casting and processing individual pieces of lead type in the upper register with the tools of the trade spread out below in a didactic and legible manner familiar to anyone who has looked at the later illustrations for Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie. In fact, 70 years before the publication of the better-known symbol of Enlightenment knowledge, the Bignon Commission was at work on what they called a sort of encyclopedia. So they used the term encyclopedia to describe their own endeavor. They began the Description des Arts by documenting the print arts because they reasoned print was, and I quote, the art that conserved all others. And this is a notion that gets repeated throughout their various working notes and their sort of advocate in the way they advocated for the importance of this project. Now, soon after beginning work on the Description, the commission was tasked with surveying Louis XIV's medallic history and publishing the survey in the form of a book titled Médailles sur les principaux événements du règne de Louis le Grand avec des explications historiques, which that's the long version of the title. And I'll refer to this title henceforth as the Médailles de Louis le Grand, or just the Médailles. And I am showing a folio of that here. The Médaille was the only official history of Louis XIV's reign published during his lifetime. And it was viewed as a technical feat. It was prized for its material, formal, and symbolic coherence. In 1702, the Journal des Savants praised it for having forgotten nothing that could contribute to making it more perfect, and I'm quoting it here, whether for the composition, the engraving, or the printing. Now, finally, by 1694, the commission was tasked with developing the Romain du Roi, the typeface with which we are now all rather familiar. And as Riccardo mentioned, the médaille, which first appeared in 1702, employed the Romain du Roi. So for over a decade then, this group, the Bignon Commission, they oversaw the description, the médaille, and the Romain du Roi. And the Bignon Commission had multiple briefs to preserve knowledge, to perfect artisanal processes, and to record an official version of the king's history for posterity. So I'm really interested in sort of exploring the relationships between these projects, even though the commission had its attention split in different directions. Now, notably, the Bignon Commission member, Louis Simoneau, he contributed to each of the prints that I have reproduced here. He produced the type founding diagram at left, the decorative border and vignette of the médaille folio, and the plate of letter bodies that are reproduced at right. So we are now looking at details of each plate. And I want to ask this question: what does it mean that a single group of people was so invested in these three projects, documenting art and trade, producing a luxurious illustrated compendium of the king's medals, and inventing a new geometrically pristine typeface? And what were the respective roles of craftsmen, who are figured at left, of printmakers figured in Simoneau's name in the band at center in very faint script, and of academics whose recommendations are plotted in the grid at right? The committee's array of activities shows that under Louis XIV, new approaches were taken to modernize typography and the print arts as a means to solidify the visual and material coherence of royal publications. Now, at the time the Bignon Commission convened, print had already been firmly established as a truly modern technology, one that gave Louis XIV and the savants he sponsored a significant advantage over the ancients in their ability to preserve and disseminate information. Print was, in theory, the ideal tool to deliver official and highly regulated texts and images to glorify the king. The letterpress offered the promise of incorruptibility, endurance, and rationality, conferring authority on whatever words it generated. Embedded in type's mechanical reproducibility was the promise of sameness. Each lowercase a of a given typeface in a given size would be interchangeable, and each impression of a text edition would have identical content, identically configured. This scene offers an idealized depiction of the Imprimerie Royale, which had been housed in the Louvre since 1640. It displays the manual processes by which language was transformed into palpable print. In the image's lower register, activities are organized clockwise in a didactic demonstration of type founding, typesetting, and letterpress printing. At bottom left, a man delivers weighty reams of paper, the material ground onto which royally sponsored and sanctioned words were impressed with greasy ink. Above him, two figures cast and polish pieces of type, while to their right, men arrange these characters into words. Setting at type cases, typesetters transpose handwritten texts held in a visorium device at eye level by placing each letter into their compositor's sticks. Each line is then dropped into a galley tray, the container for a page's worth of type. Under the rightmost arch, a pair of workers inks this form with leather balls and then passes it through the letterpress. Beneath the printers, two kinds of scouring take place. At right, a man scrubs set type forms in a solvent bath, cleaning them before their next impression, while at center, an editor scans printed texts for errors. Now, in the upper register, agile assistants hang humid sheets of paper to dry in the light-filled mezzanine. Combining discursive and pictorial modes of address, this illustration implicitly engages with the double nature of writing itself, which is always both material trace and abstract language. Inscribed in the balustrade that crowns the composition's proscenium-like frame are three names, familiar to you all, I'm sure: Gutenberg, Fust, and Schoeffer, the triumvirate credited with introducing the letterpress to Europe in the 1450s. Thus opening the way for mass communication in the West and enterprises such as the Imprimerie Royale. Immediately below this homage, which you can see in the detail I've extracted at right, are angels bearing branches of fleur-de-lis, and they flank a Latin device announcing the purpose of the French royal printing press. Penned above a symbol of the Sun King is the motto Servet et auget, preserve and augment. Printing served to multiply, fix, transmit, and perpetuate knowledge, as Chevalier Louis de Jaucourt, author of the Encyclopédie article on printing, would later reflect. The model also communicates the Imprimerie Royale's duty to conserve Louis XIV's glory for posterity and enhance his prominence through the reproductive power of the press. Since the advent of the printing press, French rulers had sought to harness its power as a way to shape and control the historical record. Louis XIV participated in this tradition from a young age, building upon investments in typography pioneered by Charles VII and François Ier. The motto, preserve and augment, also alludes then to the workshop's custodial charge under Louis XIV. One-of-a-kind, highly valuable type punches were transferred for safekeeping to the Louvre, where a new typeface, the Romain du Roi, would soon be added to its rich holdings. The royal letterpress depicted here and the royal mint for medals were neighbors on the ground floor of the Grande Galerie of the Louvre. This is perhaps unsurprising given their overlapping objectives to forge official artifacts through metal, operate presses, and guard treasured matrices. Beyond their technical and vocational kinship, the two enterprises shared a common purpose, that is, to create mobile monuments to the king in multiple. The symbolic content they printed and minted was supplied by a single academic body, called the Académie Royale des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres, which was originally referred to as the Petite Académie. This was founded in 1663 under Colbert at the behest of the king, and the Petite Académie had one objective, and that was to unify intellectual and artistic activities to conform to the king's political vision. This medal, produced in 1663, registers the establishment of the Venerable Committee, and this is the medal's modification, representation, and accompanying description in the médaille in 1702. Now, on the medal's reverse, Mercury, the Roman god of commerce and merchandise, writes with an antique stylus on a tablet, while behind his back, a vessel overflows with medals. At his feet sits a tray fashioned for a numismatist to organize his treasures, and the medal's motto declares the purpose of such tokens and of the cohort of men who designed them. It says, rerum gestorum fides, or monuments faithful to great actions. The word monument usually evokes visions of subjects that far surpass medals or folios in size, such as triumphal arches, equestrian statues erected on pedestals, or towering columns. In 1662, the year before Colbert elected him as a founding member of the Petite Académie, Chapelain proclaimed that medals in the antique style would, I quote, by their gravity, make them more proportionally resemble royal majesty. Antique precedents conferred authority on these portable, reproducible, and enduring tokens of the king's reign, which were designed to surpass their modest size in the glory they bestowed on their subject. The minute could be monumental in its temporal ambitions, as Robert Wellington's book on the medallic arts under Louis XIV has shown. In his preface to the Médaille de Louis le Grand, the Petite Académie member Abbé Paul Talmont wrote that the medal was, I quote, a durable monument and made for transmitting to posterity the great events that it represented. The publication of the Médaille was destined to demonstrate Louis XIV's successful emulation of antiquity at the same time as it asserted his modernity. What made Louis XIV's medals different from those of his French, European, and Roman predecessors? It was their regularity, unity, and comprehensiveness that were supposed to set them apart. Now, while in the first decades of his reign, the process of creating new medals was somewhat halting and haphazard, the Petite Académie's approach to designing and producing medals was completely overhauled in the 1690s, When the Bignon Commission began meeting, Bignon himself became Inspector General of this numismatic project. And one of his interventions was to have all metals updated and recast to have the same smaller dimensions of 41 millimeters. And in the sort of more luxurious, larger format folios, the size of the metals gets enlarged to about 71 millimeters, but in smaller quarto versions of the publication, they are reproduced at actual size as 41 millimeters. So this pursuit of standardization finds an echo, of course, in the scheme of standard sizes developed for the Romain du Roi. Further insights into the Bignon Commission's investment in the relationship between metals, type, and print can be found in the only volume of the Description des Arts that the Commission produced. The manuscript dedicated to the print arts, which was produced by Jaujon that Riccardo discussed earlier. And of course, this was ironically never printed. So I am showing its frontispiece, which depicts not the print arts, but rather imagery of metals. This suggests to me that the modern art of printmaking was consciously situated by the Bignon Commission in relation to the ancient art of making metals as a way to confer authority and prestige on this more modern practice and technology. So we can see in the bottom left, Minerva doles out instructions to attentive young sculptors, while Mercury, the same figure chosen to personify the industrious spirit of the Petite Académie, he oversees a group of youthful artisans who are busy painting, measuring, drawing, and sculpting bas-reliefs. So now behind them, workers carry the metal-like reliefs up ladders to adorn the courtyard of the theatrical setting. In addition to sharing a commemorative purpose, both metals and type were made using processes of engraving, stamping, and casting. And it is notable, of course, as Riccardo mentioned, that Grandin, some of his training likely happened with someone who produced dyes for metals. Now, furthermore, Jaujon explicitly evoked the commonalities between metals and type in the introduction to his chapter on type punch engraving, for which this drawing serves as the opening vignette. Now, Jaujon wrote that the art of engraving all sorts of figures and letters on the flat tip of a piece of steel, he writes, is one of the oldest known to us, if it is true that it was by this method that coin, works, and metals were made. He continued, stating that coins, I quote, rendered public what was once only for a few people in certain places, and that metals were made, he wrote, to transmit to posterity the personal images and acts most worthy of a sovereign's memory. So like money and metals, type was a metallic art that could multiply, transmit, and preserve a monarch's legacy, Jaujon claimed. Before embarking on a detailed discussion of the methods of type engraving, Jaujon lingered on money's origins in the hands of Janus, the Roman god of thresholds and transitions. In this opening vignette, Janus is shown at left receiving a visitor, a sickle-bearing Saturn. The latter sought asylum in Janus's home of Latium, where he taught his host the secrets of agriculture and animal husbandry in exchange for refuge. Janus is often depicted as having two faces, not unlike the coin he holds in the hand in this image. To their right, a man is shown striking coins. His strain is echoed by that of a farmer in the background, whose body mirrors the artisan's, the raised switch, a transposition of the cocked hammer. The laborer plows the earth behind his stocky donkey, such that the trio's flexing muscles conjure a primal rapport between artisan, laborer, and beast. Type engraving's juxtaposition to field work in this composition asserts at once its difference and its similarity. On the one hand, it shows that metals and type were conceived as practices related to the foundations and the progress of Western civilization. On the other hand, their proximity shows that the engraver's actions remained associated with unlettered labor. Embedded in the Description des Arts were both esteem for and mistrust of the mechanical arts. So on the one hand, the mechanical arts had benefited from a boost in status in the late 17th century, thanks to the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. Partisans of the modern camps, such as Charles Perrault, heralded the useful knowledge supplied by inventors and artisans as key to the present's unparalleled progress. And I share here a print made by our friend Louis Simoneau, which was made after a painted allegory of the mechanical arts from the Salon of Perrault's Hôtel Particulier. And just shows that the mechanical arts were top of mind. Now, on the other hand, those who wrote about the mechanical arts remained frustrated by what they perceived as artisans' inability to articulately or truthfully explain how they worked. In writing and illustrating their description of the arts and industries of France, the Bignon Commission had to confront this contrast in expression and terms. At first glance, the plates of the Description des Arts et Métiers seem to similarly highlight the brute physical strength required of the print arts, and by comparison, the sage reason of those who observe and describe them. In Quinault's print illustrating the process of type punch engraving, which is bound in Jaujon's 1704 manuscript and accompanied by a handwritten description, in this plate, Quinault emphasizes the muscularity of the workman's maneuvers throughout the plates of artisans at work made for the Description des Arts. Simoneau and Quinault often fix figures in a hyperkinetic manner that signals the distinctly physical nature of their activities. Later, Diderot defined métier, the word for trade, in the Encyclopédie is the name one gives, I quote, to every profession that demands the use of arms and that is limited to a certain number of mechanical operations, which have as their aim the same object, that is, that the worker repeats without ceasing. Now, in de Billette's unpublished preamble to the Description des Arts, he argues for the project's role in preserving knowledge for posterity in a manner marked by its exactitude, completeness, and, I quote, uniformity of style, a uniformity echoed by the regular dimensions of the recast medals and the Romain du Roi fonts. De Billette wrote that the members of his commission needed to work in concert. He says, because unlike the Académie Royale des Sciences, where each person goes off on whatever scintillating project or experiment that presents itself without considering consequences or next steps, here it is a continuous work that must be discussed exactly and completely. For the same reason, it is necessary, for goodness sake, to have a uniformity of style. To arrive at this unity, de Billette continued, individual authors needed to understand the ethos of the enterprise. Otherwise, one risked their great unhappiness, believing we distorted their work, he wrote. Only through consensus and by, I quote, correcting, redressing, and augmenting the author's texts could the work be, I quote, brought to perfection. Now, underlying de Billette's comments is the notion that uniformity was desirable and perfectible through the subordination of the self. Expounding on the difficulty of writing about the arts, the royal historiographer Philippe Bien lamented in 1676, if words are like so many brushstrokes that form images of things in the spirit, there is nothing in the arts so necessary to judge all sorts of works than to know what each word signifies. For it is often that workers do not execute things as we imagined, for they do not speak in a language we understand well. And of course, in sharing these quotes, I'm thinking very much about the difficulty of translating the geometric prescriptions provided by the Bignon Commission and the role of Grandin in interpreting them and adapting them using his embodied knowledge and his eyes. Just as prints disseminating Truchet's mathematical tables for the Romain du Roi exaggerate the role of geometry in their execution, so too do prints from the Description des Arts and their imitators project a fictional command of the means of visual representation. Scientific perspective orders the composition at top, and the tools displayed below are laid out in the neutral nowhere of the blank page. The final plates, such as this one showing the type founders, assert certainty and resolution, unifying, as de Billette intended, the choices printmakers and artisans made throughout the circuitous path of producing images such as these. By only considering the final published prints, analyses of the split composition plates have ascribed a disproportionate degree of certitude to their authors and illustrators. And this is something that you see in particular in literature on the plates of the Encyclopédie, which were absolutely based on these, although made about 60 years later. Such assessments set printmakers in trenchant opposition to the embodied knowledge of the workshop. In the case of the Description des Arts, we have exceptional insight into Simonot's process of correction, the processes by which unity in the plate was achieved, because Simonot's preparatory drawings survive and are now held at the archives of the Académie des Sciences in Paris and also at the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal. So here we see the drawing on which the print was based, which survives miraculously. Simonot's drawing process was more like that of making the Romain du Roi type punches. It was evolving. It was a responsive exchange between artisan and academic, between hand and mind, just as Grandin's pieces of type were broken and made again. You can see Simonot was making amendments to his drawing. This difference is clear if we compare the workshop scene from Simonot's plate on type founding. You can see it again here, and back to the drawing. Well, in the print, Simonot has reconfigured the space to accommodate an extra step in the access of activities. He has added architectural features, floor tiles, ceiling beams, and mullions to accentuate the perspectival logic of the scene and dutifully adhere to academic conventions of pictorial space. He has also, of course, smoothed away the pasted addition of the wood-burning stove, which you can see in the drawing, illuminated by sort of an orange flame. Sketches for the Description des Arts reveal a less confident and more fumbling portrayal of artisanal practices than that encountered in the final plates. This is due in large part to the preparatory nature of the drawings. The page is a place to sort things out and think things through, tucked away in folders and often in fragments and rarely, if ever, reproduced. Simonot's drawings not only document the work of the artisan, they also document the work of the scientific illustrator. So in Simonot's draft for a diagram of a copper plate printer's workshop, which you can see left, and forgive me for the poor quality of the image I took it left. The printer is shown sort of ghost-like in multiple moments as he sets the wheel in motion. You can see him in the top vignette. Beneath him and his colleagues is an array of tools, which I photographed in raking light, a detail of which you can see at right. And we can see these from press parts to pots of oil, and all of these tools have been gathered and glued to the singular surface. They were first drawn on separate sheets of paper, and then they were cut out individually and rearranged. This instability of figure and ground, depth and surface is even more apparent in Simonot's study for the art of leather tooling and gilding. In the space above his red crayon sketch of the atelier, the draftsman supplements his drawing of a curved rocker or a pallet with direct impressions from the artisan's decorative metal stamps. While the drawing of the workshop implies Simonot's first-hand visual observation as the source of his knowledge, the stamps offer a haptic register of information and proof of physical contact. Above, the characters être, E-T-T-R, probably excerpted from the word lettre, I imagine, the word for letter. These are smoke-proofed multiple times on the page. They are tactile tokens of the bookmaking process and a direct index of a mechanical procedure by which words become print. Amputated, repeated, and flipped, however, these phonic fragments are ultimately rendered nonsensical. The information Simonot values and seeks to preserve is not to be found in a string of letters that produce a verbal description, but in a physical trace, the matter and contours of which do the work of signifying. This text is not meant to be read left to right or top to bottom, nor does it assert any sort of semantic coherence. The processes of assemblage and accumulation that underlie the plates of the Description des Arts thus constitute a sort of material heteroglossia, one that fractures the synoptic vision asserted by the central perspective of the upper vignettes, a sightline that might otherwise project the privileged status of supervision. A look at these working drawings shows how, in large, ostensibly comprehensive projects, the management of parts can often subtend the fabrication of an authoritative whole. In the publication process, the piecemeal nature of these images is occluded, smoothed over in the unifying plane of the copper matrix to give a more rational, unified front to these depictions of manufacturing and to the royal institutions that documented them. In writing and illustrating the Description des Arts, the Bignon Commission sought to produce an account of the perfection the arts achieved during Louis XIV's reign. The purpose of the médaille was to record the events of the Sun King's lifetime and to show through its very form, its beauty, its perfection, the great heights artistic production had attained under the king's patronage. For the publication of the médaille, Simonot was responsible for etching the 28 ornamental plates after designs by Bérain. And these frames were used to frame the king's medals, which he executed after designs, excuse me. Now, early proofs of the volume show that originally the printmaker's signature was visible on the bottom edge of each plate. In official editions that were produced later, the plates were cut down with the result that Simonot's name was excised from the matrices and from the resulting impressions. The frames were intended to be a harmonizing element, one that made the pages rhyme like ordered type. And within the scheme, there was no place, it seems, for an individual such as Simonot to distinguish himself. In apparent rebellion against this exclusion, however, the printmaker reinserted L. Simonot sculpsit and the initial LS in tiny script in the foot margin of several plates, an assertion of authorship that can still be detected in certain surviving sheets. The publication also suppressed the inscriptions of the medals sculptors, which were existent on the medals themselves, and only a few early impressions included the original preface that gave credit to individual artisans. Given that this volume was intended to unite the king's accomplishments into a collectible narrative of which the sovereign was viewed as sort of the sole author and actor, diverting attention to the artisans may have been perceived as jeopardizing the univocal authority of the publication. Overexposure of the artisanal processes by which this narrative was fabricated would threaten the miraculous force of what Louis Marin has described as a homogeneous corpus of metallic history, totalizing in its volume the glorious body of the king. In this way, the manner in which the Bignon Commission engaged with artisans marks a sort of experiment in management. What was an unprecedented collaboration also lays the groundwork for a split that would come to define the mechanical arts at an even greater scale. That is, the systematization and mechanization of craft knowledge and the division of labor this facilitated. As issues of artisanal authorship and anonymity in these three related projects reveal, coordinated adherence to a prescribed artistic program served a political imperative. The power projected by the texts printed for Louis XIV required the evocation of a sovereign hand. In the case of Grandin's work, this meant departing at times from the committee's geometric instructions. And in the case of Simonot, this meant building up a seamless illustration from irregular parts. The artistic and artisanal processes by which the Bignon Commission's directions were executed thus reveal both advances precipitated by and limitations encountered in the improvement of the print and mechanical arts under Louis XIV. Throughout the Bignon Commission's interrogations of how to transmit knowledge and best represent their sovereign through the perfection of print, we can observe participants questioning whether and how to hold space for themselves in these operations. They do not automatically abnegate Simonot's signature and experiments with mark making, along with discussions of Grandin's irreplaceable skills, reveal an unease with calls to evacuate the self for the sake of unity, precision, or objectivity, with the allure or specter of mechanical exactitude altering the terms of their labor, Louis XIV's artisans found ways to assert their value as irreplaceable, unscalable practitioners. And in conclusion, I'd just like to thank Nelly Gable for inviting me to visit her atelier in Douai several years ago. And once again, thanks to Riccardo and James Mosley. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. There's so much information, and I wanted to quickly mention that because there's so much content, I'm gonna post a couple of things in the link. We collectively, and I thank again Sarah and Riccardo for this, but put together like a bibliography, a joint bibliography from the two lectures that you just heard in a centralized space. You guys are welcome to look at that, and we'll include that in the future archive version of the lecture, and it will be accessible as a link in a few different places. So thank you for both of your collective efforts. So I would like to ask a few questions from to both of you. And I wanted to then open it up to our attendees to add questions as well. So my first question, perhaps to Sarah, and the relationship of the Crown and the relationship to this committee is fascinating, and I think like the genesis of a lot of this stuff is I think rooted in the creation of the Academy of Sciences, right? So in like 1666, there's the Academy of Sciences in a somewhat perhaps loose organization, which gets a little bit more structured by 1695, sort of around the time of this project. But one of the things I'm super interested in is like that signals essentially kind of a rise of standing of science within France proper under the auspice of the Crown specifically, I think as contrast to what happens in Britain with the Academy of Sciences. But also I think like a very notable rise in bureaucracy, and it's kind of like a lot more meetings, more paperworks. But also I'm very curious about the technological advances that happened around this time. I'm specifically thinking of like the microscope and telescope. And I guess like the question, if it's, a little bit maybe vague, how the sort of the advances in science and technology in the 17th century affect the art, specifically the art making, and perhaps in some way affect this project specifically.
Yeah, that's a big question. I would say that I can answer it in two ways. First, how was it that these advances in science insinuated themselves in artistic production? I would say that in the realm of painting and sculpture, while there was an Academy of Sciences, there was also an Academy of Painting and Sculpture that was founded in 1648. The question of the role that geometry should play in artistic instruction was hotly debated. So on the one hand, you had a printmaker and instructor of drawing such as Abraham Bosse, who thought that all students of art should have this sort of fundamental training in practical geometry. Whereas another camp, of which Charles Lebrun was sort of the most prominent figure, thought that perspective and sort of an understanding of geometry should be learned in a different way. So the way that science sort of impressed itself upon artistic practice was debated and varied. Recently, Georges Farah has done really interesting work sort of pushing back against the notion that science sort of strong-armed, for example, landscape architecture and this construction of gardens at Versailles. And he's sort of pushed back against it and talked about the way that many sort of more sort of prosaic or established methods of surveying or terracing land that had existed for decades or centuries were still at play and used even as these gardens were made to look, as some have said, like mirrors of infinity that sort of reflected the expanding universe that was made possible by advances in telescopes and microscopes. And I would say that similarly, with the case of, to bring it back to the Romain du Roi, sort of, well, on the one hand, it's seen the Romain du Roi, and I'd welcome Riccardo's weighing in on this, was sort of cutting edge in terms of the way that it was math driven, in a sense, in terms of how it was presented to the punch cutter. The way that it was ultimately executed was not in a way that was any sort of more cutting edge than it had been before. I believe that Grandin did develop a tool to help him make the counter punches, or the contrepoinçons, to make them sort of more regular in their dimensions, that he called it the precision agent or something like that. So he was trying to invent tools that would help achieve the precision that was being asked of him. But there's this really fascinating tension in this period that I find sort of animates my research, which is the tension between these ambitions towards precision, which are fed by scientific advances, and the realities of what's possible, given the sort of the imprecision of the human body, of the eye, of the hand, and of available technologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated also, like in the work of Father Sebastian Trichet, and I think Riccardo mentioned that in kind of the structure kind of rethinking the bodies. And Riccardo, your own, I think, work in advancing kind of the research possibilities of using technology to look at printing and kind of standardizing some of these things, I think is quite revolutionary and has deep implications. I mean, perhaps you can maybe speak to Father Trichet's like use of microscope. I mean this, I think like a lot of the work that he was able to do would not be possible without sort of these new technologies, which I think in some ways profoundly change the context of how people understand the world. I mean, like for probably for the first time in humanity at that point, being able to see things that we could only imagine, both up close and further out. I think it's just a paradigm shift of immense implications, but just being able to apply those kind of theoretical scientific insights into very practical means. Could you talk a little bit about like perhaps the role of the microscope in this endeavor?
Well, first of all, just to start from one thing that Sarah mentioned, they actually tried to develop several tools for, let's say, for make the working on the punches easier and more precise. And especially there was a jig that was Fournier made a kind of fun out of that. That was a jig. There was also something for counterpunching, but there was a jig that is shown in one of the plates and is about striking the matrices basically. So it was a piece of machinery that was basically aligning the matrix with aligning the punch with the matrix, so that you didn't need to do it by hand with your eyes. And Fournier make fun out of that, saying it's much better to do it as it always been done. But actually, something like from the middle of the second half of the 1700, all the foundries in England, for instance, had machines like those. We don't know if they copied from the Romain du Roi, or maybe they reached certain conclusions independently, but they were using machines that were the same kind of machine. They try to solve the same problems that the Bignot Commission tried to solve. I wouldn't give but I didn't study enough this material to have clear ideas about that, but I didn't give so much credit to Grandin. I think it was the Bignot Commission who pushed into this direction because they wanted to reform everything they could. And it was I remember a passage that Jean was basically complaining that Grandin was not able to draw this machinery, this piece of machinery that he was trying to develop with him. So they had to ask other people to help them drawing it. So and also the Trichet system of typographical point, basically, but it's very complicated because basically he changed 3 times completely the basics behind these ideas. Basically, they were building gouge, so little pieces of metal to measure pieces of a type, pieces of a punch that were all related to the body, basically. So starting from the depiction of the different bodies, of these related bodies, they went to all the small details of the letters, and they were preparing tools to help the punch cutter to achieve certain measurement, certain precision, let's say. So yes, it was probably, and then another thing that have always been fascinating is these people were, they must have read and they must have loved, Pascal, Descartes, these kind of things. It's the same age, basically. So it's the scientific aspect was huge, the mathematical aspect was huge. Truchet was a very intriguing figure. He went through different things. I mean, he really worked on completely different fields, and he was, I don't know if he was using microscope. I cannot tell you this because I didn't find any reference, but he was using lenses, and also just the systematic thing he did was amazing. He just started taking specimen, started taking printed books, and say, okay, let's measure all the Cicero and see what's, and this was again, I don't. It's a mix of being, I don't know, brave and naive. Probably because they didn't know, they were not part of the establishment, so they could, think much outside the box. Something that probably the establishment was not able, because at the time, I imagine, like in the 1500, if you were part of the group of the guild you had certain big boundaries around you that didn't let you really, embrace new ideas. Something that these people did completely.
Yeah, I think like it's sort of a natural follow-up question, which again is maybe a little bit broader, but I would love to ask you both this question in terms of the legacy essentially of this endeavor. I mean, I think the both of you touch on sort of the relationship of this material to the people involved, and certainly kind of how history has viewed. And I think what's interesting in what Riccardo, you mentioned like because of the lack of use of this type, it probably hasn't had a direct influence on other punch cutters, but there's other forms of influence that comes up, and you mentioned that. And so, and same for you, Sarah. It feels the like the relationship of this project to the legacy, and the suppression essentially of the craftsman, and despite that, and kind of the obvious highlighting of the king and all of this, the suppression of the preface and everything. Yet, 330 years later, and certainly even before, but we're talking about the craftsmen. The Simonot is known, Grandin is known, Louis is known, Alexander, like the people who made a lot of this work. The committee members are known, and of course the king, is the king. But despite the fact of how much pressure they put, we still are talking about the people that made this work, and there's so much material that still is to be discovered. Again, perhaps like what do you think, what do you feel like is the most important part of the legacy of this project?
You want to go first, Riccardo?
Okay. Um, Difficult to say. One thing is the manuscripts, I think. I mean, the actual work of the committee on the trades, on the related trades of printing. Because these people went, they check everyone who was experienced in punch cutting, in type founding, in matrix making, in all the different aspects. So their account is much more precise and much more, how to say, much wider than Fournier's, than Moxon. So it's older than Fournier, and it's much more, it's wider. So I would love, one thing that I would love to is to read it properly. I don't know French enough to go through the manuscript, but I would really love to. I read the parts of it that were translated or that were transcribed by James. By the way, James, I realized not much time ago, but James submitted his transcription to I think the Mazarin Library. They have it there, so it's kind of public, let's say. Anyway, I think this is very important. So the historical part, also because I'm very fascinated by this. I mean, what really people was doing at the time. They were interviewing the craftsmen. This is one point. The other point is the design. Definitely the italic was something striking. We were talking about the Franklin italic before. I mean, this is something else that is really crazy if we think about the history as a line, as a line when things have some sense, one above the other. And I'm sure, and I'm not sure, but from what I see, Baskerville and Bodoni and other non-French punch cutter and type founder were not familiar with this type. But anyway, it had an impact in France, and it's some if we think about the main feature of French modern Roman and Italic types, they were all in the Romain du Roi already. So as a local, as a national, how to say, as a national style of certain letter forms, it had a huge impact. Something that today is difficult to understand because we don't have any national, any national style anymore, and we haven't had it for 100 years, probably. But at the time, it was very clear. So I think there are these two things, to my opinion, are the most impressive, let's say.
I'll just follow up on the question. First of all, I should just say that I'm not a connoisseur of typography at all, but I'm absolutely enamored of the Romain du Roi. I think it's incredibly beautiful, and it was incredibly powerful to see the type punches in person. I mean, the fact that they've been saved all of these years is kind of really sort of a testament to perhaps the particular brand of French patrimony, both the tangible and the intangible. Now, I would say that if the Romain du Roi as a typeface didn't have sort of an immense impact, I think that the impact of the Description des Arts had actually quite a large impact, but one that has been really overlooked and misunderstood in the scholarly record. I mean, Diderot and D'Alembert, if you compare plates from the Description des Arts, which had a very, almost no circulation, very few impressions were pulled. They didn't make it into full publications. The Description des Arts didn't really sort of get achieved as a publication until the 1760s, at which time the Encyclopédie already existed and sort of had already made a splash and looked like it was a completely original project. But if you compare the plates from the 1690s to the plates of the Encyclopédie, they stole motifs from the Description des Arts. So it's not just about so they were borrowing both sort of the format or the composition, which was very, in many ways, sort of a late 17th century invention that goes back to Leclerc and other illustration projects of the Academy of Sciences. This is just to say that the Encyclopédie was absolutely building upon the work of the Bignon Commission. And there's even sort of evidence of in prints that are in plates that are held in the Institut de France of sort of annotations on some of these prints from people who worked on Encyclopédie. So I think that's perhaps one of the more significant and underappreciated legacies of this project.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Riccardo, you alluded to this, like and Sarah, you just alluded to that as well, like the criticism or kind of maybe the misconstrued history, sometimes just due to the nature of time, but oftentimes very intentional misconstruction and kind of misinterpretation for maybe perhaps personal reasons. Riccardo, if you could, I don't know, touch on the relationship to Fournier. I mean, he seems to be one of the most vocal critics, which then I feels it kind of sets the tone for misinterpretation, misunderstanding of this project, all the way up to Updike and others.
I completely agree. And Mosley at the end, I can't remember which article. I think it's the one of the Romain du Roi, the 2011, I think. He basically concludes that we cannot be sure of blaming Fournier. Let's say we don't have evidence that he was really conscious of that he knew everything, and he was attacking the Romain du Roi as a personal, act to basically protect the things that he had taken from them. We don't have evidence for that, but it's highly unlikely that this didn't happen, because anyway, there are connections in. Basically, I remember that the Jean-Jean was one of the craftsmen that Jean-Jean was interviewing, was working in the Lebet foundry, and the Lebet foundry was taken by the father of Fournier, was bought by the father, and then was directed by this older brother of Fournier. So it's quite unlikely that Fournier didn't know anything about this project, and but probably Fournier didn't understand the size of the project, because he just focused and he just talked about the Romain du Roi. But we know that the Romain du Roi was one of the tasks of this committee. I mean, they were interested in a wide, bigger picture. So I think, but this is just personal, idea. I think that he knew it, and he was harsh with them because he took some ideas. Maybe he found confirmation of ideas that he already had, but he found them, and after this he had to defend himself a little bit. But this is just a personal hypothesis that I can say. The truth is that for hundreds of years, the Romain du Roi was known through the lenses of Fournier, and this gave a very bad gave a very bad reputation to it. We need to wait for Jean, 1961, to have a complete picture. And I can imagine that one like Mosley in 61, it was in his 30, no, not even, it was 20, in late 20s, but must have been shocked in reading Jean, and must have decided to start looking into that, because the subject is so interesting and so different from all the rest. So it's really a strange chapter in the history of type, because these people were really able to do things that, if Baskerville was a revolutionary, these people were much more revolutionary than Baskerville. You can imagine that people around were a little bit skeptical, and maybe someone could just easily, blame them for being naive. But it was more than that, we've seen.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I think the first maybe Sarah could take. There's a kind of a two-part, but Eli asks, or first as sort of a statement. Riccardo talked about the forging of documentation by England to create confusion, how that pushed forward the need for standardization, codification of type forms to ensure the authenticity of official communications. So I think I'll ask this of Sarah, but Riccardo, feel free to add as well. But I think this feels like more of Sarah's question. How much influence would you say the social needs in the advancement of the arts compared to purely creative scientific pursuit?
Okay, looking at the question. So in this case, I guess I could answer that question in two ways. To follow up on I suppose Sasha's question earlier about sort of the role of the sciences in artistic production. There's another sort of episode that I could mention, which is that in 1663, so around the same time that the Académie des Sciences is being founded, there's this push by Christian Huygens, who's a very prominent Dutch scientist, to establish something called the Compagnie des Sciences et Arts, so the company of science and arts, which would focus on basically the improvement, the perfection, the advancement of technology and infrastructure that would serve the state and would serve its economic interests. So the idea that art and science could serve society, perhaps not necessarily in the most democratic or altruistic way, but could at least serve the that was something that was being discussed. I don't think, if I understand your question correctly, I don't think that the Romain du Roi, it was not created with concerns about as you could say, the sort of the forging of documents. They're really interesting episodes in the history of currency and type. I'm thinking of a really interesting article by Jennifer Roberts on Benjamin Franklin's nature currency, the sort of casting of leaves in order to create currency that couldn't be sort of imitated or replicated because of the unique imprint, the fingerprints of leaves. Basically, that's the late 18th century. So yeah, but this is to say that the Romain du Roi doesn't have that sort of that kind of ambition, to my knowledge. I think that they wanted something that sort of in surveying, and again, Riccardo is right that there's not sort of a really clear articulation of exactly why they decided to create the Romain du Roi. So I'm inferring from sort of the bits and pieces that are left in the historical record that they were surveying what they had at the Imprimerie Royale, and they had recently recovered the Grec du Roi, and they were in the process of sort of filling in missing characters, and Grandin was employed to do that. And that there was sort of this decision that, hey, if we're embarking on all of these really big publishing and editorial projects, there were also projects called the Cabinet du Roi, which I won't go into, but there were all of these really expensive and luxurious projects to reproduce and describe everything that the king did and owned and produced. And so it kind of just makes sense in a way. I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? But it makes sense that if they're going to the trouble of having all of these copper plates engraved and hiring the best printers and binders, why don't we also have a really special typeface to, just the cherry on top?
Right.
Yeah, just to follow up very quickly. I don't think that they didn't have any connection with forging themselves. Also because there is a 1 century apart from this episode to the inception of the type. I think that if we need to condense in a few words, the Romain du Roi is the response to the calligraphy that the king loved a lot, the calligraphy of Jarry and all his those masters. Because if we really check at the details of the lowercase letters, we find everything there already. But calligraphy was always in history ahead type, and so we need to wait these moments like Romain du Roi, like Baskerville later, when the type is connected a little bit to calligraphy and is always very conservative compared to where calligraphers have already gone. What happened during the revolution is, from what I understand, because I didn't investigate more than very briefly, is that basically the people in charge realized that the design features of the Romain du Roi was easy to recognize and it was easy to teach people how to recognize them. Like the bilateral serifs on top of the ascenders. And so, given that these features were not in basically any other commercial type at the time, they were used as a to make a distinction with what could be forged, basically. So that was just a consequence for the peculiarities of the design of a Romain du Roi. But it's very difficult to imagine that the people, the new commission decided to make things in a certain way so that they were distinguishable. No, they wanted to make, like Jean said, they wanted to pair the calligraphy of the masters basically with a new type.
No, I think it's also like very interesting. I mean, this is definitely a detail that I found for myself with discovering in James Mosley's notes about like perhaps the influence of the presence of Ben Franklin in France at the time and the work that he was doing. Sarah just mentioned his work in creating these the currency that he was doing in Pennsylvania, but then he continued to sort of tinker, innovate with his printing in France. And perhaps the time was right for the work of Romain du Roi to have these things to kind of come together and give it sort of another life in that space. But I think you're right. It's like there doesn't seem like that was not the point. And certainly I think that I think the very notable feature of the spur on the lowercase L has been misconstrued perhaps as a bit of a counterfeit thing, and I think that's often like a very seductive an easy idea of like, why does this exist? And certainly as you just mentioned, Riccardo, it's a very much a calligraphic
Yeah.
affectation. It's very much from the calligraphy, which also in a way anticipates what you just said. What Baskerville and others are going to do is bring the hand, bring the scribe, the calligraphy back into type and innovate that next kind of generation of typefaces. So there's this like incredible, interesting confluence of things happening. I think one question that Grant put in the chat, I think Riccardo, perhaps you could speak to that in terms of this idea of the plates, of course, and kind of this design and engineering of these with the rise, and I'm reading Grant's question, with the rise and domination of the Nordseye school of in quotes painted type. How can the constructive ideology of Romain du Roi find a place? I don't know if that's like an easy question to to unpack, but
I'm not a big expert of Nordzai, and yeah, I don't know actually how to answer to this question. What I found extremely fascinating, especially in rereading recently some Mosley and Jam's work, is the fact that these plates were changed afterwards. Well, the fact that the committee was changing alongside with the work on the patches. So it's a mutual, it's a mutual, the two different works that inform each other, basically. So it's not just that the punch cutter has to follow the model. Okay, it has to, in principle, it should follow the model, but then, working on small scale, it will find out that certain things don't work like that. The certain letters are too wide and certain are too narrow. And so it will change it, following his eye, as Jean was imagining. And then what happens? That the committee starts modifying their drawing, their models, to go closer to him. And they keep on asking to cut again more letters. So it's a very interesting process to me. It's like if, through the work of Grandin, they realized that things could be made in a slightly different way, even better than what Grandin was doing. So they made a new model, and they asked Grandin to follow the new model. So this is also the distinction why there is in the list that I presented of basically of the number of punches that Grandin noted down that he worked on in just that 1 year and a half. Well, there are a certain 100 and something punches that were clearly, mentioned as punches that were redone to follow the new models. And the price is the same for the rest of the punches. But it was just to remark that from what I understand, that those punches were not done because they didn't work, but like the others, they were not destroyed because they didn't work. But they were redone because they decided that they could be made in a better way, basically. So it's a very interesting mutual process. And that I never seen it actually. I never seen in history that it's like this. Because if I mention Arrighi hired a punch cutter, a goldsmith to cut his punches. But you can imagine that he was writing the letters, and the punch cutter was copying, was trying to mimic his handwriting, basically his single letters. This is much more, complex as a process. It's a double way of trying to reach a final shape.
Yeah,
So
I
I'm
think,
sorry, I
yeah,
cannot answer very well on the North-Side question because
yeah,
also because I don't know enough about North-Side
yeah.
theories, and I don't know if this can somehow help the
I
question.
think it does. I mean, I think it's very interesting. I mean, like I'm glad you bring this up because it's definitely like a detail that is often again like kind of missing the relationship, that it's not just like a committee one, like there's the perception of like the plates are made and Grandin is just cutting and says like I'm just gonna do the best I can. And I think Fournier kind of supports that. Like it's
Yeah,
just, the plates are why do you need squares to make an O? Like that's so ridiculous. I love that quote, but it's kind of it's just it's a clearly a misunderstanding. But the back and forth is fascinating. Like the fact that they understand the limitations of what their knowledge is, and they need perhaps a young and inexperienced punch cutter like Grandin to start to, and also tell him and push him to say this is not good enough, to go back, and then they take the insight that Grandin brings to them and revise their thinking. I think it's
yeah,
just like maybe it goes back to the initial discussion we had about like the science and the Enlightenment, the kind of this idea of experimentation. It's like you put a hypothesis out there, and through a process of testing, you discover whether your hypothesis was right. But rarely is it like dead on. You get some data, and then you go back and you sort of adjust your hypothesis. And I think, Sarah, you mentioned a lot of like the relationship of like the back and forth even with the plates, and like how much Simenon, which is also like a figure often kind of is missing, the conduit between a lot of this, like the committee's ideas and putting them into these kind of, another craftsman in between, and kind of how Simenon is reinserting himself and putting himself into these plates in very kind of tangible ways. It's fascinating, like trajectory of this. And this is probably one of the few times that I think we're well, history is very thankful for deep bureaucracy, but like the fact that there's so many notes, and I'm sure there's so much still to be discovered in these
yeah,
collections. But thank God that these committees kept such meticulous notes, and Grandjean has writing and
Yes.
their invoices, and we can piece together a lot of the stuff, and still more to be
Mhm.
to be discovered. Maybe my final question, sort of bringing back to type design, and we can close on that perhaps. I am kind of surprised by, and maybe Riccardo, you could speak to that, how few revivals exist of Romain du Roi. And I wonder if that's mostly because like the design is maybe half baked. Is it just like I know that there's been a few revivals, and it's certainly a fascinating topic for within type design. I think community, they know Romain du Roi, but I'm astounded how few revivals exist. What do you think is?
yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. And also recently, we have seen some, contemporary type, digital type that had some features of the Roman de Roi, like the bilateral serifs on top of the sentence. But it's extremely rare. I mean, we don't have, apart from a very few typeface, we don't have this. We haven't had this. And I don't know. I don't have an answer for this. It's I know that James Mosley made a revival of Roman de Roi because he was enjoying working on photographer and making revivals, and he was using in his material. And but I don't know why. It seems that it's never that the main features, the most interesting, the most important, the most striking features of the Romain du Roi, they never become part of the average typographical world, apart really a few cases. And I don't know, maybe because it was again because it was not conservative enough. I don't know. I know just one person that uses the L with with a little a stroke on, and so yeah, I'm not able to answer this question, but it's an interesting one. But would be probably need an open discussion among several people, to understand why. I mean, I would like to ask also some old people why nobody has tried.
Can I ask one
Of
more
course.
question? Sorry, I
Yeah,
think it'll be
please.
a quick one, but it's of you, Sasha, who teaches, type this sort of the design and history of typography, and you, Riccardo, who is a type designer. Do what in our various sort of digital era, where perhaps fewer things are still printed, thank goodness, but fewer things are printed. What kind of conversations need to take place? I mean, now we don't have punch cutters, but do you have to have when you're designing a typeface, what do you have to have conversations with printers? Are there ever sort of material frictions that a typeface encounters in 2025 in the way that it's even remotely akin to what transpired in 1695?
Well, this is about technology. So basically, I would say that in the last 20 years, we lost all the problems with technology. The last one was, low resolution screen. Printers, you need to go back to the 80s, basically. So when basically the rotary presses of used for newspaper were really making a mess. So you needed a certain features of a typeface to work well in certain environment. But
Hmm.
after the 2000, where printing basically became high quality everywhere, more or less, and also the screen, low resolution screen became a minority, at least in the Western country. Basically, today you design a typeface without many boundaries, without
Wow.
many
Hmm.
limitations. So, but if you think about very recently, I mean, 20, 50, 40 years ago, yes, you had to discuss with Gerhard Unger to make his, or also, I don't know, Matthew Carter to make his typeface, were always talking to engineers,
Hmm.
always.
Yeah.
But now, yeah, you don't have these limitations, technological limitations anymore right now. So for certain people, they lost, like I remember Gerhard Unger saying this. They lost how to say a big amount of ideas because the limitation was a huge, starting point from where the construction, from where building up a design. So
Yeah.
I think the to that point too, I feel like the design sort of generally, design maybe with capital D, often I feel thrives within limitations. I think it's sort of often like a driving force. Like it's the constraints that kind of generate really interesting results. And I think once you start losing a lot of the boundaries and the constraints or problem solving, that like something like designing at small sizes that always like became an issue and kind of created really interesting results. I think limitations have to come from somewhere else, and constraints have to come. And I think that's sort of where design feels like it finds itself now, is in this like space of what if hypothetically anything is possible. There's no boundary that keeps us from imagining something. How do you imagine? I think that sort of becomes the tricky thing, is like, is the market, the client, so to speak, driving it? Who's the driving force? What is the response of the craftsman, like, and certainly the artist. I mean, I think it's a both, right now in 2025, in the 21st century, the artist and the craftsman are kind of one and the same. which is a fascinating kind of thing to think about as well, which very much goes to that idea of the advancement of science and art, or at least like that's the full title of Cooper Union, the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. And I think there's a very appropriate kind of forum for this. And Peter Cooper, the founder of Cooper Union, was very much inspired by the things he saw in France. So I think he took this like to heart very, very much and brought that here. But I'm really astounded by how much there's still to learn. I'm really, really grateful for both of you for bringing this to light. And I really hope, I mean, I feel like I said it at the end of most of our lectures, but I really hope the folks who are watching this today in the future will be inspired to continue to research and continue to dig into this incredible material. And I think we all are living in the legacy of James Mosley's work and the phenomenal work that he's done to bring this to light. And I wholeheartedly agree and believe that there's still so much to do, and this research will bring light to things and hopefully inspire others, maybe not in just the research, but in the making part. So I'm immensely grateful for you, Sarah. I'm immensely grateful for you, Riccardo, for taking time to speak with us and have this conversation and just bring your insight to the forum. And I really appreciate that. So I wholeheartedly thank you both. Wish you healthy and restful as much as one can hope for end of the calendar year and into the future. Thank you both so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Sasha. Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you very much.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you both. Thanks everyone for watching. Stay healthy, and happy holidays to everyone.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.